And here we go again. It's the long way, 28th class, 1st of March now in 2021. But if you'll open to Revelation chapter 9, we'll be getting into what is a pretty technical kind of a chapter, I guess, in a way. A lot of work back in Josephus again, much like last week. Got to deal with a couple of other issues. It's a bit of a thorny sort of a chapter, I guess. Before we get started, though, I really did want to just say thanks on air, I guess, to my brother who's up from Sedona, Arizona, several weeks now, helping with the remodel. He's putting in 10, 11, 12, and 13-hour days, and we passed an electrical inspection today and got plumbing a few days ago, and so we're coming along just spectacularly well. He had to silence his hammering just so I could broadcast here this evening. And then our younger son, Mark's going to be leaving for Texas shortly, and he's spending the last week with us before he'll be leaving. So he, too, is thrown in and been accomplishing just a tremendous amount of work here. I'm distracted then as a result, then feeling guilty because I've spent time working on preparing this class while they're remodeling my house. So I thought at least I should say thank you. So here we go. Let's roll on into chapter 9 tonight. The review is so tremendously important and yet time-consuming, so you really just can't do it each and every week. But it's everything, as you know. So hold on a second. I forgot to click over here. If we forget the theme, if we forget what's in the background, if we forget what's gone before, it's very easy to lose the trail again. So let's just start with this chapter 5. Chapters 5 through 11 brings the first half of the book to a close. The book clearly is two very different sets of information. They are dealing with exactly the same things, but presenting it in very different ways. So we've come now in chapters 5 through 11 to the opening of the 7 seals that only Jesus is worthy to open. The chapters 6 through 11, we have these 7 seals opened, but 6 out of the 7 in just the first chapter, chapter 6. So I think even just in that fact, we have the recognition that it's not the seals that are so important, though they represent the troubles of the Jews with the Romans prior to the revolt of the Jews and then the actual war with the Romans that lasts for 3.5 years. But these are sort of introductory kinds of things. It's the scroll that is behind these seals that is the bulk of the information about the answer to the prayer of those saints under the altar in the 5th of those seals in chapter 6, verses 9, 10, and 11. Chapter 7 then says to wait. The saints were told to wait just a little while under the altar. And now in chapter 7, we have to seal the 144,000. We're introduced to the great multitude as well who have come through the great tribulation. And everything here is pointing to first century events, the Great Tribulation of Matthew chapter 24, just for instance. So however you cut it in Revelation, twice in the first 3 verses we are told these are events that are shortly to come to pass. And as the book is unfolding, we're looking at events certainly, surely, in the first century and with regard to the Jewish revolt against the Romans and then the Roman assault against the country and eventually the city and finally the fall of Jerusalem itself. The 7th seal is opened last week in chapter 8, and now chapters 8, 9, 10, and 11. It's hard to say whether you want to count it as the opening of the 7th seal, which I really don't like to do so much, as to say when the seal opens, the book is opened, the scroll is unrolled. The important thing that Jesus was worthy to reveal now, and in its fullness, is being presented in chapters 8, 9, 10, and 11. So it's the scroll itself that is these chapters, and these chapters revolve around warfare. Every symbol has something to do with terrible distress and calamity that is related to warfare. From the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, it's about the war of the Jews and the Romans at the middle of the 1st century. So with chapters 8 through 11, you have now 7 trumpeting angels. Each of them is going to sound. Each of them unleashes some sort of disaster. And 3 of them will be distinguished from the others. And so we've looked at chapter 8. We've come to chapter 9. Let's read the first 2 verses. The 5th of these angels sounds, and I saw a star from heaven which had fallen. Very important you recognize that he does not see it falling. John says that it had fallen, so it's portrayed as a done deal, which had fallen to the earth, and the key of the bottomless pit was given to him. He opened the bottomless pit, and smoke went up out of the pit, like the smoke of a great furnace, and the sun and the air were darkened by the smoke of the pit. And I have no doubt that what we're referring to here is Satan's influence lying always lurking in the background of all of these events. This is all about terrible evil. It's about the sin of the Jews who not only rejected their Messiah, prophesied for centuries, but actually murdered him in the most excruciating manner possible. It is about retribution for those Jews, then persecuting the people of Jesus who accepted their Messiah. And in such a terrible manner, for 40 years this has been going on. So from that 5th seal in Revelation 6, 9, 10, and 11, we have those very saints crying out for vengeance. The chapters we're studying now, particularly chapter 8, indicates that is the answer to that prayer. Their prayers and fire from the altar are mingled and thrown down to the land of Israel, to the gates. And this then is step by step going to guide us through the 3.5 years of those Roman problems. But Satan's behind it all. It's evil and wickedness everywhere. It's not that Rome is righteous. The Jews are suffering at the hands of an unrighteous nation because they, as an unrighteous people, have rejected the only truly righteous man who ever lived, our Messiah and Lord Jesus the Christ. So let's talk a little bit about Satan's influence here this evening. And I'm going to put up a whole string of scriptures, most of which you will find in the syllabus. I think I added 1 or 2 here this evening. But in this first couple of verses here, it's important for us to remember that from the time that Jesus arrived and began casting out demons, Zechariah's chapters 12, 13, and 14 were being fulfilled. That Satan's power was being curtailed. Eventually, demons would be completely eliminated in the not too distant future with the apostles' work from the earth altogether, and they'll never be able to possess anybody again. So Satan's influence has already been greatly curtailed, and the redemptive sacrifice of Jesus has been offered, of course, throughout these now 35 years from the cross to the time of Revelation's prophecies. But the curtailing of Satan's power is only to a certain degree. He still lives, he's still active, he's still influencing people, but from the time of Jesus, limited, and we're going to see limited to an even greater degree in the chapters that follow. So let's just go back and read about this limitation on Satan, beginning in John, the Gospel of John, chapter 12, and verses 27 through 33. John 12 and verse 27. Jesus is in great distress, and he says, "My soul has become troubled, and what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour? But for this purpose I came to this hour. Father, glorify your name." There came therefore a voice out of heaven, "I have both glorified it and will glorify it again." The multitude, therefore, who stood by and heard it were saying that it had thundered. Others were saying, "An angel has spoken to him." Jesus answered and said, "This voice has not come for my sake, but for your sakes. Now judgment is upon this world. Now the ruler of this world shall be cast out. And I, if I be lifted up from the earth, will draw all men to myself. But he was saying this to indicate the kind of death by which he was to die. Now, if you look over chapter 13 and verse 1, just a few verses later, before the feast of the Passover, Jesus, knowing that his hour had come that he should depart out of this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, loved them to the end. And during supper, the devil having already put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, the son of Simon, to betray him, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands and that he had come forth from God and was going back to God, rose from supper, laid aside his garments, taking a towel, girded himself about, poured water in the basin, washed the disciples' feet, and began chapter after chapter in the Gospel of John of that last night. Before they go across the Kidron Valley, Jesus is to be betrayed, and come morning will be hanging upon the cross. So in John 12, leading immediately into the events of the cross, we have Jesus saying it's a time of judgment, and Satan is the ruler of this world. So first, and perhaps to the greatest degree, one might say, in some respects, that we'll study in later chapters of Revelation, but first, the sacrifice for sin is offered, and Satan's control over those who had died in their sins, or if they had been faithful Jews or even faithful Gentiles following that law of the heart, had died. These people were still awaiting a time of judgment and of reward, of release and reward, that was going to be tied to the sacrifice of Jesus, now his blood actually covering their sins, where the blood of bulls and goats never could. And then we're going to enter a period of 40 years where, like a period of probation, the Jews have time to come to their Messiah. And at the end of that time, then Jesus will unleash these forces to punish those Jews who would not receive their Messiah, but to reward those first martyrs in the fifth seal of Revelation 6, 9 through 11. And so I think something we've largely missed in our Bible studies, and for a long time now, is that there is stages in which Jesus is curtailing Satan's power and rewarding certain saints based on their long deceased but previous relationships through the time that's from Adam to the fall of Jerusalem. And these stages can be found in a number of places in Scripture that I'm not going to be able to spend a lot of time with tonight, or maybe ever in the course of this class. But be on the alert for that. Recognize that this is an unfolding plan, and we're in the period now of a little while waiting for that last martyr of the first century to die so that we can see these events then completely unfold. In the book of Revelation, just a couple of years before these things will actually take place, is written to these seven churches to prophesy these soon to come to pass events. So Satan surely is cast out of heaven in some sense, limited somehow with the events of the following day in the Gospel of John when Jesus offers his sacrifice and 3 days later then is raised from the dead. Let's look again at Luke this time, chapter 10. And in the 10th chapter of Luke at verses 17 through 20, as we think about Satan's bindings, plural. Luke chapter 10, verses 17 through 20. The 70 returned with joy, saying, Lord, even the demons are subject to us in your name. And he said to them, I was watching Satan fall from heaven like lightning. Behold, I have given you authority to tread upon serpents and scorpions and over all the power of the enemy, and nothing shall injure you. Nevertheless, do not rejoice in this, that the spirits are subject to you, but rejoice that your names are recorded in heaven. So here note that in Revelation chapter 9, Satan is depicted, it's Satan, we'll see that in a minute, but this is Satan that we're talking about, as having fallen, already fell, not in the process of falling, but it's past completed action. He had fallen in John's revelation there in the book of Revelation, where here Jesus is saying, I'm watching it happen. I'm seeing it happen. And then these miracles are countering ill effects that are still in Satan's arsenal of power, but which are being taken away from him. Demon possession maybe being the most preeminent of them. Let's have another look now at Revelation chapter 9, just a little bit later in the chapter, so we are certain about this identification. So Revelation 9 has told us, if I can just get over there myself now, that when the fifth angel sounded, I saw a star from heaven which had fallen to the earth. The key of the abyss, the bottomless pit, was given to him. Whoever this star is, he opens the bottomless pit. Smoke goes up out of it like a great furnace. The sun and the air are darkened by the smoke in the vision. But when you skip to verse 11, these locusts that are about to be unleashed, they have a king over them, which is the angel of the abyss. The bottomless pit of verse 1 and the abyss of verse 11 are one and the same. The star that fell from heaven to the earth had already fallen from the earth in verse 1 that has the key to this bottomless pit is the king. His name in Hebrew is Abaddon, and in the Greek he has the name Apollyon. And if you'll look down about 3/4 or a little farther in my syllabus notes, you'll see there Abaddon means destruction and Apollyon, destroyer. It certainly both terms refer to Satan. And then if you'll skip over to Revelation chapter 12, so 3 chapters later, there's going to be a sort of a reset and start over at an earlier date in the telling of this great story of the book of Revelation. So chapter 12, verse 1 clearly opens up an entire second section of the book, starts earlier than the first part did, but is going to be dealing with exactly the same things. In chapter 12, verses 7 through 9, there was war in heaven. Michael and his angels waging war with the dragon now, and the dragon and his angels waged war, and they were not strong enough. There was no longer a place found for them in heaven. And the great dragon was thrown down, the serpent of old, who's called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world. That phrase will be mightily important to us in a few weeks. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. Well, that's exactly what I think Jesus was talking about in Luke chapter 10 and in John chapter 12. This dragon is the devil and Satan. He deceives the whole world, and he's thrown down again. So all these passages are talking about Satan being cast out of heaven. And wouldn't you like to know more about that? Well, tough, because there isn't any more really to be known about it. So little is said about this, and it's endlessly curious to us, of course. But as enticing as the topic may be, if God has chosen not to give us a lot of insight into it, then we're just not going to know. So there's a couple of other obscure passages that deal with the topic. It's not my purpose to get into those here this evening. Just let it suffice here in John's Gospel, which most likely is the writer of the book here, and then Luke, words of Jesus in both, and in Revelation, that this is Satan having fallen because of the mighty power of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ in his ministry on the earth and in that of the apostles that followed him, as he is being defeated at every turn. And by the time we get to chapter 12, he's going to be real unhappy about it too, he is. So one last passage, though, about Satan, and something that ties in directly with Revelation chapter 9. Let's go back to Ephesians and these first 3 verses in the Ephesian letter of chapter 2. Chapter 2, verses 1 through 3. Here Paul tells the Ephesians that he says, you were dead in your trespasses and sins, in which you formerly walked according to the course of this world, according to the prince of the power of the air, of the spirit that is now working in the sons of disobedience. Among them we too all formerly lived in the lusts of our flesh, indulging the desires of the flesh and of the mind, and were by nature children of wrath, even as the rest. So as the second chapter opens up here, we have this prince of the power of the air, the Spirit working in the sons of disobedience. He is involved with all things that are earthly and sensual and devilish, demonic. So again, clearly, I think, a reference to Satan, which, when we come back to Revelation chapter 9, in this case from Ephesians, I think is referenced, perhaps, likely, seems to be, there at the very beginning. The fifth angel sounded. I saw a star from heaven which had fallen to the earth. The key of the bottomless pit was given to him. He opened the bottomless pit. Smoke went up out of the pit like the smoke of a great furnace, and the sun and the air were darkened by the smoke of the pit. Well, here is Satan unleashing forces out of a pit that are dark and smoky in a great furnace. And what it does is it fouls that which would otherwise be wholesome and good on the earth. The sun is darkened. The air is darkened by the smoke of the pit. And so in my mind, at least, it just has to do with Satan just clouding the issue. Let's say it that way. He just permeates everything. He's everywhere. He's always there. And he's tempting us at every possible turn. And when we're ready and fighting it off and we can identify something that he's trying to encourage us to do that we ought not, or not to do that we should. And then when we're unaware and distracted and doing something else, and he hits us from behind and catches us by surprise. But he is like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour, relentlessly pursuing to the death everyone. And so his influence has been worse at other times in the world. You and I haven't lived in a time of demon possession. So we think it's bad. Times are tough. We don't know anything about how bad it has been. And this then, and all these verses are dealing with the same ideas that Revelation is, but in the Gospels it was 35 years ago. Now, these are events that are soon to come to pass. And all of it is about defeating satanic influence in human beings here on the earth. So Satan got cast out of heaven with his angels, and there's been a war ever since between flesh and spirit, between truth and lies. He is the father of lies and a murderer from the beginning, but he has restraints and limitations because God and Jesus and the Holy Spirit are more powerful than he and his minions will ever be. And their greatest defeat is about to take place here as it's being unfolded in a final one in the history of the world until the ultimate end, which yet lies ahead. His curtailings are about to be even worse soon as this book is revealing it, though he'll still have influence all the way down to the very end. Now, with all that said, let's come on over to verses 3 through 12 and then these equally fascinating locusts. It starts like this. Out of the smoke came forth locusts upon the earth, and power was given them as the scorpions of the earth have power. And they were told that they should not hurt the grass of the earth, nor any green thing, nor any tree, but only the men who do not have the seal of God on their foreheads. Now, we had some sealing going back in chapter 7. These men who do not have the seal of God on their foreheads are going to suffer. Those who do are not. Now in verse 5, here is a huge translation question. I've confirmed and have a firm conviction about it with several people through the years, done this more than once. I did it again today. One of my favorite Greek students I consulted and again confirmed that there at least appear to be two ways that you can translate this fifth verse. These two ways are essentially completely opposite of each other. And I'm going to pick the one that doesn't usually appear, in the translations. I freely admit that. I'm no Greek scholar. I freely admit that, even more freely. But nonetheless, I know a little bit about it, and I can consult with people I know who know a lot about it. I think there's a problem with the translation. The way the New American has it is they. Well, who's the they? Most people think the locusts. I don't. They were not permitted to kill anyone in the New American Standard, but to torment for 5 months. And their torment was like the torment of a scorpion when it stings a man. So we'll come back to the translation, and I'll give you some more information about that. Let's finish the thought first in verse 6. And in those days, men will seek death and will not find it. They will long to die, and death flees from them. And the appearance of the locusts was like horses prepared for battle. And on their heads, as it were, crowns like gold, and their faces were like the faces of men, and they had hair like the hair of women, and their teeth like lions. And they had breastplates like breastplates of iron, and the sound of their wings was like the sound of chariots, of many horses rushing to battle. And they have tails like scorpions, and stings, and in their tails is their power to hurt men for 5 months. They have as king over them the angel of the abyss. His name in Hebrew is Abaddon, and in the Greek he has the name Apollyon. The first woe is past. Behold, 2 woes are still coming after these things. When the 7th seal was opened, so that the scroll could be opened, we get 7 trumpeting angels. 4 of them had already sounded. In verse 1, the 5th angel sounds. And when he does, and you might mark this in your Bible, from chapter 9, verse 1 down through chapter 12, the last 3 angels are particularly bad, and so they are called the 3 woes. The first woe of the 5th angel, and then the 6th angel is the second woe, and the 7th and final angel will be that 3rd woe. These 3 woes begin in chapter 9. The first woe is chapter 9, verses 1 through 12. The second woe is chapter 9, verses 13 through 11, verse 14. And then the 3rd woe starts at 11:15, where in 11:15, if you skip ahead, the 7th angel sounded, there rose loud voices, etc. That's the start of the 3rd woe. And then it apparently ends rather rapidly there at verse 19, although when we get to verse 19 of chapter 11, I'll have quite a bit to say about that, because it's really hard to tell if that's where the woe ends or not. But be that as it may, tonight we've just got 2 of these woes to deal with. So we come back to chapter 9 again. We have Satan's influence opening up this pit to befoul the air and the sun and unleash these locusts who are no kind of fun. Out of the smoke, in verse 3, came forth locusts upon the earth, power given as scorpions have power, told they should not hurt grass, green things, or trees, but only those who do not have the seal of God on their foreheads. Well, all right. What's the only thing that locusts usually harm? The 3 things that are named that now they can't harm. So we have a sign. Locusts that aren't really locusts. They're not going to behave like locusts. They don't look like horses, like locusts. They look like horses and men and women. Okay, so the sign is there to give us, in a most powerful way, a visionary understanding of physical events that will transpire on the earth in a very little while. But there aren't going to be any actual locusts. There aren't going to be any actual horse with long hair men. It represents terrifying, awful things. And the gist of it all is that these bizarre creatures are tormenting those people who would not accept Jesus as their Messiah, the Jews that would not come to Christ. So, in verse 4, they were told they should not hurt grass, green things, or trees, but only the men who do not have the seal of God on their foreheads. Well, they can't hurt the men who have the seal of God on their foreheads. Those people got out of Dodge. They understood Matthew 24. They knew that when they saw the abomination of desolation, they should flee the city. Then, when Luke records that identical same sermon by Jesus, instead of abomination of desolation, Luke records that Jesus also said, so Matthew records one thing he said, Luke records the other thing he said. Jesus said both, but each author only wrote one. Luke says, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, know that her desolation is at hand. Well, those were the Roman armies. Both passages, Matthew and Luke, told us that all those things would take place in the generation that Jesus was talking to. So, these events, likewise, are taking place in that generation. And the Jews who had come to Christ, believing Jesus, saw the Roman armies come, and they fled. They left. Eusebius tells us they went to Pella out in Perea, where you'll remember the wine and the oil was not harmed, while everything else was, back when we were opening up the first 4 seals. So then, verse 5 is our big problem for the night. The verse that can be read 2 opposite ways. Here we have in verse 5, most people think, and the translations tend to lend to that idea, that the locusts can't kill anyone. They can only torment, and they can only torment for 5 months. They're torment like the torment of a scorpion when it stings a man. However, and if you look here particularly at the syllabus tonight, I made a special point right in the middle of the page. Look for the bold they, followed immediately by those without the seal of God. This is how I would translate the verse, which comes out the opposite of what is in the New American Standard, for instance, but which I've confirmed on several occasions is a valid way to do it. And in fact, I heard today again, interlinears do it the other way. And the interlinears are notoriously more accurate. They're not very fluid. They're very difficult to actually sit down and read, but they're much more precise about representing the full and exact meaning of each of the words in a sentence. And in the interlinear, it comes out the other way than the New American does, in the way that I certainly much prefer. So here's that other way. They, closest antecedent to this pronoun, are the people in verse 4 who do not have the seal of God on their foreheads. They, the ones without the seal, were not permitted to kill them, the locusts. The unsealed are not permitted to kill the locusts, but to be tormented 5 months by the locusts. So it's either that the locusts are not permitted to kill anyone for 5 months, or the men who have the seal of God on their foreheads are not permitted to kill the locusts for 5 months. And I much prefer the latter. I prefer the latter, first because it's a perfectly valid translation, but secondly, and with regard to that translation, I think particularly important, and I mentioned that in the italics of that new translation I provided, right after the emboldened, but to be tormented, it is a passive form there, to be tormented. Well, it's not the locusts that get tormented. It's the people with the seal on their head that get tormented. And they are not allowed to kill the locusts because the locusts are going to be tormenting them for 5 months. So I don't think it is that the locusts can't kill anybody. I think it is that the people who don't have the seal can't kill the locusts, so they can't stop the torment. They will continue for 5 months to be tormented. And verse 6, in those days, men will seek death and not find it, and they'll long to die, and death flees from them. Well, that's the whole point of all of this, is that you can't stop your tormentor. Your tormentor is a terrible problem, and you would prefer that you would die. But in these events, you're not dying. You're just being tormented by beasts or creatures, that aren't locusts to begin with, but are only depicted this way. So come on over to my notes. And you can see, I realize when you got a translation difficulty, you're certainly going to have an interpretation difficulty. And when we're trying to see the interpretations, and we have more than one translation, well, then we have more than one possibility for an interpretation as well. And sometimes, you can just get lost in it. So I struggle a little bit in here. But as I look at the verbiage, and then I look at what it's surrounded with in the chapters and how everything's lining up in the progression of this revelation, how it's certainly all limited to events that are shortly to come to pass in the first century, then I go and I read the history, particularly that of Josephus, which we'll see a lot of here in just a minute. This history seems to be indicating an actual 5-month period of time. There is, in the midst of the 3.5 years from the start of the Jewish revolt, Cestius Gallus coming in, failing, and then the Jews, the Christians, fleeing the city when they had their opportunity, and then Gessius Florus coming in to be the next Roman general, I'm messing that up. It's Vespasian I'm thinking of. Vespasian is going to be coming in to obey the orders of Nero and actually conduct this war until there's a revolt in Rome. Nero commits suicide. There's terrible distress. They call it the year of the 4 emperors, a little over a year, but Galba, Otho, and Vitellius try to take over the throne. Vespasian sees the whole empire's tottering. His soldiers suggest to him very strongly, and he agrees then, because they are so forceful about it, that he should go back to Rome and become emperor, which he does. He then leaves his son Titus behind. There will be a lull of about a year where we've got, Vespasian highly distracted by all of this. Titus has to come with more troops so that you have a period of time where things are just kind of percolating. The Romans are there, the Jews are trapped, people are dying, it's awful, but it's not full-on war that's being waged. And then comes Titus. And the last 5 minutes, 5 minutes, that's a little bit too soon, short and little. The last 5 months, an actual 5 months, in which Titus has been breaching walls and finally has the last of the Jews in all of Israel, save for Masada and a few places, but really all of them, penned up in Jerusalem. And the last 5 months are the worst of it all, until finally, after terrible suffering and starvation and things we're going to read about in a moment, finally the Romans succeed in breaching every wall, and they burn the temple to the ground and tear it down so there's not one stone left on another. But those last 5 months when you're reading Josephus are just so hard to just wade through. It was by far the worst. Woe, woe, woe to the survivors of the first 3 years of this Roman assault. Because those guys in that last half year, those 5 months in particular, they'd suffered all the rest and far worse when it right came down to the line. And I think that's what we're talking about in this material here, and particularly about the seditious Jews penned up inside the smallest part of Jerusalem now, and then particularly the Temple Mount, and a 3-way civil war battling that went on among those Jews, who Josephus charges with being most responsible for the fall of Jerusalem. They were by far the most wicked of all the people. They tortured the people that survived, and were trapped in there with them, worse than anything you can imagine. And this goes on for literally 5 months. as Josephus describes. I think these ghastly beasts and going out and stinging and tormenting and hurting and all of this is what this is talking about. But they did not go out and wholesale kill everybody. It's Jew against Jew, and a lot of people are dying, but there's also a lot of robbery going on where they're not trying to kill anybody, they're just trying to steal stuff. It's just a nightmare. So not permitted to kill, and who is it, and all of that, and we'll look at the translation and everything, but when it winds up, what I think is there were people dying, but it was 5 months where that really wasn't the point so much as the suffering in this vision. It's the last 5 months before Jerusalem and the temple itself actually falls. So let me first show you again how to reference Josephus in what is the most popular way. There are two ways that his book has been parceled out so you can reference it. And I like, and most people use, the number that comes first followed by a colon is the book in Wars of the Jews. So Wars is a big book, but it's sub-books, it's volumes. Book number. Then you have chapter number followed by a period. And then you have the paragraph, and there'll be many sentences in the paragraph, but the sentence isn't numbered. So book, chapter, paragraph, when you have colon and period, and three numbers, scattered there, for Josephus. This list you may want to have. And the intervening paragraphs and chapters also, when you're thinking about these last 5 months. So I'm going to start tonight with paperwork that I forgot to bring over here, so pardon me while I go get it. I guess I should have called for my assistant, huh? Donna's standing over there watching this show go on. Okay, so with regard to these locusts now, I'm going to give you a list on screen that will have all these passages. And in this case, you're looking at Wars of the Jews, book 4. That's supposed to be a colon, and I got a period. After all of that, I forgot my own colon. 4:3.4, 5, and 6 are the paragraphs. So it's book 4, chapter 3, and then paragraphs 4 through 6. So still I'm condensing, but I'm offering you a good deal more than I had up here under this fifth trumpet, where I gave you a lot of excerpts from this material. But tonight I wanted to read this material more fully. So this is from Wars, book 4, chapter 3, paragraph 4. There were besides these other robbers that came out of the country and came into the city, and joining to them those that were worse than themselves, omitting no kind of barbarity, for they did not measure their courage by their rapines and plunderings only, but proceeded as far as murdering men, and this not in the night time or privately or with regard to ordinary men, but did it openly in the daytime, and began with the most eminent person in the city. For the first man they meddled with was Antipas, one of royal lineage, and the most potent man in the whole city, insomuch that the public treasures were committed to his care. Him they took and confined, as they did the next place, to Levius, a person of great note, and Sophus, the son of Raguel, both which were of royal lineage also. And besides these, they did the same to the principal men of the country. This caused a terrible consternation among the people, and everyone contented himself with taking care of his own safety, as they would do if the city had been taken in war. So now I know the passage in 9 says they were not permitted to kill, but if you read it the way I do, they were not permitted to kill their tormentors. The tormentors were killing lots of people. So my view fits the historical circumstances, and therefore the translation that I prefer fits those circumstances. It's a valid way to translate it, but it won't fit the way you normally have the translators, because they say there isn't any murdering going on, and I'm saying you can't murder the tormentors who were doing a lot of murdering. All right, here's book 4, chapter 3, Paragraph 5, the next one, again greatly condensed. It was therefore resolved to have them slain. So I think the locusts are doing the killing. Accordingly, they sent one John, who was the most bloody-minded of them all, to do that execution. This man was also called the son of Dorcas in the language of our country. 10 more men went along with him into the prison with their swords drawn, and so they cut the throats of those that were in custody there. Paragraph 6 to follow. Now the people were come to that degree of meanness and fear, and these robbers to that degree of madness, that these last took upon them to appoint high priests. So when they had disannulled the succession, the normal way of replacing priests, they annulled it, according to those families out of which the high priest used to be made, they ordained certain unknown and ignoble persons for that office, that they might have their assistance in their wicked undertakings. For such as obtained this highest of all honors without any desert were forced to, that means undeserving in the Whiston's translation, because I can't find Gallia Cornfels, you'll remember it's backed away, were forced to comply with those that bestowed it on them. They also set the principal men at variance one with another by several sorts of contrivances and tricks, and gained the opportunity of doing what they pleased by the mutual quarrels of those who might have obstructed their measures, till at length, when they were satiated with the unjust actions they'd done towards men, they transferred their contumelious behavior, there's a 1737 expression for you, to God himself, and came into the sanctuary with polluted feet. So Josephus is just horrified by the way these guys are behaving in these last 5 months. And it's bad enough the way they're tormenting all their fellow Jews, but now they're taking it upon themselves to put fools, is what Josephus describes, in the place of high priest, so they can collude with them to do more damage to fellow Jews that they had decided they were going to fight against. Here comes Book 4, Chapter 5, Paragraph 3. Now, after these were slain, the zealots, and you'll remember them briefly mentioned in the Gospels, and the multitude of the Idumeans fell upon the people as upon a flock of profane animals and cut their throats. And for the ordinary sort, they were destroyed in what place soever they caught them. But for the noblemen and the youth, they first caught them and bound them and shut them up in prison and put off their slaughter in hopes that some of them would turn over to their party, but not one of them would. All of them preferred death before being enrolled among such wicked wretches as acted against their own country. But this refusal of theirs brought upon them terrible torments. Now, I know, the word torment's used by everybody everywhere, but I think it's more than coincidental that Josephus is an eyewitness of what Revelation prophesied. And Revelation starts off by quoting in the 7th verse from Matthew 24, which Jesus said would all happen in the first generation. There's just too many of these coincidences to resort to, well, but it's a symbolic book, so we shouldn't look for historical fulfillments, and so anybody who thinks that you can actually see something in history there is most to be avoided. Brethren, I'm going exactly the opposite way on this. I think prophecies have fulfillments. And so here is Josephus describing in a 5-month period what precisely happened to the Jews who weren't sealed by their God, the ones who did not obey Jesus in Matthew 24 and flee the city. There's just too much coincidence in here. What it is correlation, because Josephus is a witness to the fulfillment of these prophecies. Now, let me pick up the reading again. This refusal of theirs brought upon them terrible torments, for they were scourged and tortured, that their bodies were not able to sustain their torments, till at length and with difficulty they had the favor to be slain. The passage here says they prefer it. But it's just coincidental, it's not historical fulfillment. We don't want to look, for a prophetic statement to be fulfilled, is the way most of my brethren approach this book. And I'm very disappointed in that approach. Those whom they caught in the daytime were slain in the night, and then their bodies were carried out and thrown away, that there might be room for other prisoners.
And the terror that was upon the people was so great that no one had courage enough either openly to weep for the dead man that was related to him or to bury him. But those that were shut up in their houses could only shed tears in secret and dared not even groan without great caution, lest any of their enemies should hear them. For if they did, those that mourned for others soon underwent the same death with those whom they mourned for. Only in the nighttime they would take up a little dust and throw it upon their bodies. And even some that were the most ready to expose themselves to danger would do it in the daytime. And there were 12,000 of the better sort who perished in this manner, slain by fellow Jews, surrounded by the Romans that had contained them in the city of Jerusalem as Jesus prophesied. And Revelation quotes from that prophecy as it begins the book, telling us these things were shortly to come to pass. Wars, book 4, chapter 6, paragraph 3. Along all the roads also numbers of dead bodies lay on heaps, and even many of those that were so zealous in deserting at length chose rather to perish inside the city, for the hopes of burial made death in their own city appear of the two less terrible to them. The terror was so very great that he who survived called them that were first dead happy, as being at rest already, as did those that were under torture in the prisons declare that upon this comparison those that lay unburied were the happiest. These men therefore trampled upon all the laws of men and laughed at the laws of God, and for the oracles of the prophets they ridiculed them as the tricks of jugglers. So we've read 4, 5, 3, 6, 3, and forgot to put them up on the screen for you there. There they are, so if you want to jot those down and read intervening chapters. And now with this section, I just want to close with book 4, chapter 9, and paragraph 10. I keep an eye on my time here. And now Simon. So you've got these 3 Jews that are leading these 3 groups. John of Gishgala is one of them. Now here's Simon. Returned to the remainders of Idumea, and driving the nation all before him, compelled a great number of them to retire to Jerusalem. This is how these people wound up in this distress in Jerusalem. He followed them also into the city. Now this Simon was a greater terror to the people than the Romans themselves, as were the zealots who were within the city more heavy upon them than both of the other. And during this time did the mischievous contrivances and courage of John corrupt the body of the Galileans. Their inclination to plunder was insatiable, and for the murdering of the men and abusing of the women it was sport to them. They also devoured what spoils they had taken, together with their blood, and indulged themselves in feminine wantonness, till they were satiated therewith, while they decked their hair and put on women's garments, and were besmeared over with ointments, and that they might appear very beautiful, they had paints under their eyes, and imitated not only the ornaments, but also the lusts of women, and were guilty of such intolerable uncleanness that they invented unlawful pleasures of that sort. And thus did they roll themselves up and down the city, as in a brothel house, and defiled it entirely with their impure actions. Nay, while their faces looked like the faces of women, they killed with their right hands, and when their gait, G-A-I-T, their way of walking, was effeminate, they presently attacked men and became warriors, and drew their swords from under their finely dyed cloaks, and ran everybody through whom they came upon. However, Simon waited for such as ran away from John, and was the more bloody of the two. And he who escaped the tyrant within the wall was destroyed by the other that lay before the gates, so that all attempts of flying and deserting to the Romans were cut off to those that had a mind so to do. Well, I warn you, that's not fun stuff to read. It is so much worse that's in there. But brethren, time and again, you see overtones in relationships and similarities that hark back to what was said in the passage. So I know it's a symbol, but it represents a reality. And the symbols are similar to the reality. So you can take the parts of these horrifying locusts and just say they were animals that were implacable in the pursuit of every kind of even homosexual misbehavior openly, all of it against their fellow Jews who, if they'd have combined, could have fought off Rome, Josephus claims, but they didn't. They fought each other as well as the Romans and ultimately came, to complete catastrophe. So let's wrap up next few minutes with the remainder of this chapter. We'll conclude this section. I've already read it, but I want to see verse 6 again after what we just read. In those days, men will seek death and will not find it, and they'll long to die, and death flees from them. And then we read, Josephus says, but the ones who do get killed, the others count, as being better off. Okay, so they, verse 11, have as king over them the angel of the abyss. And if that isn't satanic activity, we just read Josephus watching, well, then what is? And then in verse 10, they have tails like scorpions, stings, and their tails is their power to hurt men for 5 months. The 5 months is mentioned twice in this passage, and it appears to me, it's also in verse 5, to be the exact amount of time that these kinds of things were going on in Jerusalem. Verse 13, and the sixth angel sounded. This is the start of the second woe. I heard a voice from the four horns of the golden altar, which is before God, the same altar that the souls of the slain saints for the word of God were crying out for vengeance, and then their blood was, and prayers were mixed with the fire from the altar, thrown down to the earth, and started all this cataclysm. It's all in answer to the prayers of the first century saints who were murdered in the Great Tribulation. The sixth angel sounded. I heard a voice from the four horns of the golden altar, which is before God, one saying to the sixth angel who had the trumpet, release the four angels who are bound at the great river Euphrates. And the four angels who had been prepared for the hour and the day and the month and the year were released so that they might kill a third of mankind. And the number of the armies of the horsemen was 200 million. I heard the number of them. And this is how I saw in the vision the horses and those who sat on them. They had breastplates of fire and of hyacinth and of brimstone. And the heads of the horses were like the heads of lions. And out of their mouths proceed fire and smoke and brimstone. The third of mankind was killed by these three plagues, by the fire and the smoke and the brimstone, which proceeded out of their mouths. For the power of the horses is in their mouths and in their tails. For their tails are like serpents and have heads, and with them they do harm. And the rest of men who were not killed by these plagues did not repent of the work of their hands, so as not to worship demons and the idols of gold and silver and brass and stone and wood, which can neither see nor hear nor walk. And they did not repent of their murders, nor their sorceries, or their fornications, nor their thefts. That's an ugly chapter. And it's just getting down to the very end of the 5 months and final destruction of Titus, since his dad Vespasian had now gone back to become emperor. I just don't have any doubt about it. And in this case, brethren, once again, the similarity to the historical actuality is so very striking that I'm persuaded to just accept it as a fulfilled prophecy and not instead to deny it as impossible to have a fulfilled prophecy. It's a book of symbols that represent other symbols and ideas and concepts. I don't see that at all. So look at the syllabus here, and down at the bottom with the sixth trumpet, I have a segment there from book 5, chapter 1, and paragraph 6. Titus actually took soldiers from the Euphrates to swell his ranks to their fullest number for the 5 months at the end of the fall of Jerusalem itself. Now, you'll notice, and I also said immediately under that, read Matthew 24:36, where no one knew the day or the hour, 35 years ago before Revelation was written. But now the day and the hour and the month and the year has been specified for these 4 angels that are waiting at the Euphrates. Well, you can scan how Titus relates to the Euphrates and what that would mean to Jerusalem from the little 2 lines that I've got, but I'm going to give you the whole thing here from book 5, chapter 1, paragraph 6. Josephus says, God himself demonstrated that John's efforts would prove of no use to him. That's that John of Giscala who was tormenting for the 5 months the fellow Jews. God himself demonstrated that John's efforts would prove of no use to him by bringing the Romans upon him before he had reared any of his towers. So John now was also trying to build some defensive towers of his own, and Josephus says God wouldn't let him do it because he brought the Romans. And then I'm going to read that again, and this time uninterrupted commentary. God himself demonstrated that John's efforts would prove of no use to him by bringing the Romans upon him before he had reared any of his towers. For Titus, when he had gotten together part of his forces about him and had ordered the rest to meet him at Jerusalem, marched out of Caesarea. He had with him those 3 legions that had accompanied his father when he had laid Judea waste, together with the 12th legion. Of these legions, he ordered the 5th to meet him by going through Emmaus, and the 10th to go up through Jericho. A considerable number came to his assistance from Syria, and others that came out of Egypt with Titus, which were 2,000 men chosen out of the armies at Alexandria. There followed him also 3,000 drawn from those that guarded the river Euphrates. And apparently, brethren, as all of this is unfolding, they're the last troops. And it's important. Rome could never defeat the Parthians. The Parthians were impervious to every Roman attack. The Parthians maintained their unique kingdom. They maintained their government. They paid no tribute to Rome. Rome couldn't handle the Parthians. That was the borderlands of the Roman Empire. It was also on the other side of the Euphrates. So the Romans had met their match. And they kept what would be their crack troops at the Euphrates as the borderline against the one country that, had stopped them. And so they feared invasion from this other country, which had already proven itself as, more powerful than they were. They couldn't expand, the Romans couldn't, into Parthia, but they didn't want the Parthians to take land away either. So there was the great standoff at the Euphrates. Titus wanted Jerusalem so badly. He got all of his troops, Caesarea and Syria and all these others that are described, and then he even pulled the protective guard off the Euphrates. Now, brethren, I just don't think that's a coincidence that we're supposed to close our eyes to in favor of some philosophy of understanding Revelation that deprives it of prophetic fulfillment. Let's just stop doing that. When the historical fulfillment is right there, accept it. That Jesus can foretell the future. That John was foretelling the future as Revelation is handed to him. So that's where I am, is that these visions, spectacular and strange and wild as they are, represent actualities that are spectacular and strange and wild but you can read about them in uninspired history because they were foretold in inspired prophecy. Now, let's see. 8:05. We'll just have to close right there. And you've got my notes, so I've added a little bit. And chapter 10's really short next week, only 11 verses. So I'll tell you what, if you'd like to email me, of course, I'll always take your questions, and always willing to take some time if I deem it necessary in the class, to answer it. But this would be a good time with a short chapter next week, and then flowing into chapter 11 the following week, which is the end of that first section of the book of Revelation. So be reading these next two chapters. Hit me if you think you'd like to have some more clarification or support. I'm, of course, been testing these things now for these 33 years I keep telling you about. So I'm quite certain of them. But if you're hearing them for the first time, I can appreciate you might have, some kind of stress and strain with that. Forgot to put it up. It's book 5, chapter 1, paragraph 6 for the angels of the Euphrates. And exactly, I think, fulfilling all of this in prophetic imagery. So thank you so much for your kind attention. We'll be marching on again next week. And we'll go back to the sound of hammering and saws cutting and various other noises just as soon as I close out our transmission here. So thank you for being with us.